Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, for this year's legislative session, the concern was more about taking than giving. Now that the session is over, we can sift through and see who got what and who got taken. With the burden of lawmaking out of the way, full attention can turn to the fall elections, and we will look at that too, as well as Mayor Landrieu's standoff with firefighters. Lighting the way for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Jeremy Alford, publisher, LaPolitics.com. Julia O'Donoghue, reporter, NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune. And Stephanie Grace, the New Orleans Advocate, columnist for the New Orleans Advocate. Okay, folks, the session is done. It is over. A lot of action, a lot of nail-biting, and a little bit of drama now and then, too. So what happened? That's what we have you guys here to talk about, to try to clarify what happened when did it. First, we'll go to you, Julia. Who would you say are the losers, the winners?
Well, I think headed into the session, we thought that business might be a big loser, that they were going to have to take a lot of cuts. I think it remains to be seen how significant they actually took a hit. A lot of the cuts that they took ended up being temporary, we found out on the last day of session, so they're going to expire eventually. But taxes that affect people, I would say the cigarette tax for sure, other tobacco taxes, and the car title fee, those are going to be permanent. So sort of things that affect people directly, individuals and businesses, are going to be permanent. Most of the business cuts that we had talked about at the beginning of the session won't be permanent.
And so what the legislature was trying to do was plug a hole in the budget to the tune of $1.6 billion. And so to do that, they had to raise some revenue, but not raise taxes, so it would seem and be revenue neutral, and this is the big challenge, which we'll talk a little bit about too. But as far as the business taxes are concerned, basically that was sort of rolling back tax credits and tax rebates that they had been getting.
Incentives that had been given to the business community across a variety of areas. There were corporate tax sort of loopholes that were closed. There was something called the inventory tax that got a lot of attention initially. There was a utility tax that will be suspended for a year. So it's actually a pretty wide swath of taxes. And there'll be tax credits that were suspended. They'll go away for a year to 3 years, depending on which ones we're talking about.
So like the utility tax exemption, that's what that is, and so that has a sunset on it.
Right.
And then the inventory tax, how much now of a rebate will they not get? How much was taken away? It had been 25%. Did that go down to 20? Is it somewhere around there?
It's still.
Do y'all know?
It's a 25% credit that they still receive, and it's an inventory tax credit. That's above the liability for the local tax, and then the remaining 75% can be carried forward to use against the future tax years, and that's one of those business bills that are going to have a 3-year sunset. The only one that has a 1-year sunset, as far as I know, is the suspension on the exemption of business utilities. It's about a penny. They pay 4 pennies overall right now. That was a big struggle towards the end of session, whether or not they're going to take a bigger hit.
An inventory tax credit, this will not affect local governments at this point. Is that correct?
Right. They feel pretty confident.
Right, because the initial idea, one of the initial ideas was the state would get rid of the credit, but local governments would end up taking the hit because there was talk of responding to that by getting rid of the whole tax, which is paid to localities. So that's off the board for now.
Right, and that made local governments a big winner
Exactly.
early in the session, because they
True.
rely on that tax heavily.
They were scared, yeah.
Okay, so the state would save on that and thereby gaining some revenue, but also there was a tax passed, and that was on the cigarettes. So how much more now will people be paying on the cigarette tax?
So you'll be paying 50 cents more per pack if you're I guess I'll call you a traditional cigarette smoker. I'm going to be honest, I don't remember what the e-cigarette tax is.
But 5 cents per milliliter.
Yeah. There's an e-cigarette tax. At one point, there was a tax on all sorts of things, little cigars, snuff, chew. That's all been taken out. So if you're a traditional cigarette smoker and e-cigarette smoker, you're going to take a hit.
I think one industry that people are really concerned about, or at least interested in, is the movie industry. Didn't that take a hit?
Oh, that took a huge hit at the end of the day. And I mean, movie folks walked away from the session Thursday at 6:01 p.m. with their heads hung low. Patrick Mulhern, the director of Celtic Studios, tweeted that night that, if you got to take a haircut, and that's what they kept telling everybody, everyone's got to take a haircut. If you got to take a haircut, make sure it's not being done by Helen Keller. And they are talking about some litigation possibly. They're moving into a phase now where they're urging Governor Jindal to veto the legislation. But there's a $180 million cap. They're limiting the big budget projects, the big Spielberg, so that to spread the money around to more Louisiana producers. But this was a hot issue to begin with, and I think it ended in a very unexpected way.
And it ended also with New Orleans Senator J.P. Morrell really hot under the collar, and he let everybody know it.
Oh yeah, he said that he was smoked out of the process after spending a year and a half to 2 years learning about the program, holding public hearings, and he went on the floor and he said, today I don't feel like we're a band of brothers, I feel like we're a pack of wolves. So J.P. Morrell definitely had one of the most impassioned speeches of the day, and it was really the buzz at the Capitol after Sonny died.
So the obvious question, does this make the state vulnerable to losing all the movie industry that's been so proud of?
If you believe the movie folks, it will. The margin is so low, this is so tight on these projects. When you take into account what other states are offering, they're saying that it's a program killer. And the one thing they did testify about, they told the state that, hey, look, even if you don't lower the cap, even if you don't change the program, if there's another state that offers us something better, we're going there. And I think a lot of lawmakers heard that and they didn't feel too great about that.
And I think other states who have had similar programs and then killed their programs, North Carolina, Michigan, Maryland had a similar film program. When they've rolled back their program, they have seen the industry leave. So there's reason to think that that's a real possibility.
And there were a series of bills, too, that were passed that are related to motion picture industry. So basically, what I'm sort of gleaning from this is that the dust is really not fully settled, right? Where there's some saying maybe it'll be vetoed. Some of this will be vetoed by the governor.
I think they're asking them to veto, the movie folks are asking them to veto the bill that brings the cap down. And then wasn't there another set of bills that sought to kind of reform some of the abuses in the program and the questionable activities? That was J.P. Morrell's package.
Yeah,
right?
I don't think those are the bills that they're very upset about.
Right.
I think the bill they're upset about is the one that puts the cap in. The governor told a bunch of reporters yesterday, including Jeremy and I, that he was not going to veto any of the bills that were used to raise the money to close the gap, and $70 million is tied up in that film tax bill.
Right.
So,
and he has a lot invested in having a balanced budget, and
Right.
so
He does, and
Yeah.
we have to talk about SAFE, and that
Yes.
was really a big thing that he wanted to see passed.
Yes.
He was actually in both chambers where people were joking that they thought he was lost.
exactly. Yes.
But let's talk about SAFE and
Okay.
why this was so important.
Okay, it's so important because Bobby Jindal, who is making this big announcement in a couple of weeks, wants to be able to tell the world that he balanced the budget without raising taxes, which is what he said immediately upon adjournment. Now, all the people who are going to be paying more taxes might quibble with that, but the way it works is it's a scheme. A lot of semantics here. You couldn't call this fee that was assessed, you couldn't call it a fee because then it would have needed more votes, 2/3 as opposed to majority, so they called it an assessment. You can't call it a tax because he can't raise taxes. So about $1,600 added on per student at a state college with a corresponding credit, which is a tax cut under this scenario. And because you've cut taxes over here and not raised them over here, that means you're allowed to raise taxes over here and still be revenue neutral. So over here is where the cigarette tax and these other rollbacks are. So I think it's about $700 million in additional revenue they are expecting in this revenue neutral scenario.
And that was a really important thing because the governor had threatened to veto
the
budget.
revenue bills,
Yes.
like the movie tax
Right.
credit. And originally he was talking about vetoing the budget. Then later he said he'd only veto the revenue bills. And I think a lot of people voted on it. Jeremy did a good job of explaining all the horse trading, but I think there's also these legislators were looking at going home and taking to their universities and their districts and hospitals, we have to make huge cuts. So they none of them liked it. They were all disparaging it, but they voted for it.
Yeah, it had a lot of opposition. So then who are these key players who really pushed through stuff like this? Who would you say really came out as key players in this session?
John Landrieu always, of course, the Senate president, who, again, from the very beginning, this was the smartest thing. Bobby Jindal, supposed to be a policy whiz, really one of the smartest things he ever did was decide that John Landrieu should be the Senate president, because that man's had his back straight through and really kind of took care of business over in the Senate, and that limited the options over in the House. In the House, they were talking about, could we have a veto session? The Senate was not going to have a veto session. Joel Robideau ended up being very interesting. He's the Ways and Means chairman who wound up really fighting against this save credit and actually wrote the letter to Grover Norquist last week from Americans for Tax Reform saying, really, are you really demanding this of Bobby Jindal? And 10 other Republicans signed it, and Grover Norquist basically wrote back and said, "I'm not, this wasn't my idea, but cut something else if you don't like it." So
yeah, I think Joel Robideau was a key player overall in the whole session. He was really working behind the scenes and trying to put the whole package together. Inside the rails of the House, he had earned the nickname 007. They said, we need to go ask 007, which is great. I never had a cool nickname like that. But I think it's interesting to note that 2 years ago when Governor Jindal had his tax proposal, and you remember the first day he parked it. He said, I'm not going to move this forward. That was because of Joel Robideau. Joel Robideau was the sponsor of that, and before the session started, maybe just the day before, I believe.
And that was to eliminate state income tax.
Yes.
Right. He went to the governor and said, I'm not bringing your bill.
Yeah.
And so, he's kind of been a thorn in the side of Governor Jindal. And when they had private meetings the night before session, Joel Robideau was the first one in the room, and I'm told that he shook hands with the governor and wished him happy birthday. And you just kind of wonder what was going through both of their minds at that moment.
I would mention two other people. Two state senators from this area. One is Jack Donahue, the finance chair, and one is Conrad Appel, the education chair, Jack Donahue really carried the SAVE, even though it ended up not being his bill, it ended up amended onto another bill. He kind of did the governor's bit. He's someone who's actually tried to cut down on exemptions in the past and really been rebuffed by the governor, but he carried the stuff this year, and I think if he comes back, he really wants to get down and try to deal with some of these structural issues. So if he's reelected, I would keep an eye on him, and I would also keep an eye on Conrad Appel, looking at some of the structural issues with higher education, again, assuming he's reelected.
There's also the governor's team, which is really interesting. Tim Barfield, the revenue secretary, played point. He wasn't the legislative liaison, but he really was. When they had questions about what's revenue neutral, they would go to him, get their answer. But they also had a former lawmaker, Troy Hebert, this fiery Cajun from Acadiana, who was the legislative liaison, but he had this interesting role where he was really the political director and playing politics. And I asked House members, I said, hey, what's Troy Hebert telling you? And they said, look, they told us that the Senate's trying to mess us up and screw us over. And so I go ask senators, hey, what's Troy Hebert saying? They said, the House is trying to screw us over, mess us up. It's the oldest trick in the book, but it was a kind of a two-man team there for working for Governor Jindal.
So as always, strategy at play there, and we saw Walt Leger from our area really push some bills through in the very last minutes, really, of the session over in the House. He, like you wrote in your column,
he could be an auctioneer. It was very impressive because he was saying, take your seats, please. He was just rolling off the names at the end. They were really trying to push the stuff through. They were saying even, here's the conference committee bill. Sorry, you can't read it, but vote on it. Yeah. Things like that.
So, Errol,
is there still much of the old New Orleans versus the rest of the state attitude in the legislature? Especially now that the delegation is smaller than it used to be.
On certain issues, there certainly is. On film actually, there certainly is. Most of the film tax credits go to productions in New Orleans. That's the only issue I can think of right now.
During the city of Algiers debate with Jeff Arnold, there was an amendment to a bill, and it was one of these joke amendments. I think it was from Austin Badon, and to have New Orleans become its own state and remove itself from Louisiana. And you had these comments from Baton Rouge lawmakers like, well, I always thought New Orleans was its own state anyway. So I think that attitude still persists when you look at all the money that goes to New Orleans versus rural areas.
I think there's less of a divide between New Orleans, the city, and its suburbs than there used to be. That's kind of an interesting, I think, post-term limits development because some of the old alliances were broken up, and also maybe post-Katrina development when there were, regional issues, and maybe even just kind of civil rights, the fact that it's not as racially tense as it once was.
Something I definitely want to touch on, Jeremy, I'm going to throw this over to you. Behind the scenes politicking. We know that there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, and one thing is it's the conference committees. So much gets tossed to the conference committees. If you could just sort of briefly explain, what is it? What do they do? I mean, they ultimately seem to make the decision.
Right. So when a bill makes it through the process and it gets to a point where the House and the Senate cannot agree on amendments one or the other has made, but they still want the bill to continue through the process, it goes to something called the conference committee. And this is part of the system that the average citizen probably knows the least about. And what happens is they take 3 members from each body. Sometimes they'll appoint more, but it's typically 3. And they'll go to a conference committee to hammer out the differences, usually behind closed doors. It takes 2 senators from each body to send a compromise report out to the chambers for final approval. Now, we say they go to a conference committee. It's not always in a room. We say it's behind closed doors. Again, it's not always in a room. Sometimes these things take place in the hallway, on the floor. Sometimes all the members aren't even there. Maybe it's just between 2 people or even 1 person. They go around, they gather signatures. But, it's this weird process that I think deserves some close attention in the coming years, because what we saw on Thursday as session ended is, the clock is ticking down. There's just a couple hours left. There's like 24 conference reports to go through. So these bills come up, these multi-page reports, and they're passing these bills without even cracking the cover on this thing. And the authors of bills could barely even introduce them before they're moving them. And this happens, pretty regularly at the end of a session. Some sessions are a lot more quiet on the final day, but this one was really, they were just forcing bills out. And
and
if
the major
anything,
bills in the session at the very end.
Right. If there are any snakes in these bills or ticking time bombs that we don't know about, that we find out in the coming weeks, I think the House is going to be and should be held accountable for that final day.
So we really don't know a lot that's in there, a lot that they have passed, because they strike amendments, they add amendments. Like you said, nobody has a chance to read them.
And
Right.
even after we figure out maybe what's in a conference committee report, it's very hard to figure out who added what, and that's all privileged communication. So last year we had an incident with the head of the state police getting a pretty nice retirement package in an unrelated bill, and it took a long time to figure out who actually put that in. So even if there's something surprising in one of these reports that Jeremy was mentioning, even after the fact, it's going to be very difficult to tell who exactly added that, how that got in, that type of thing.
So the session's adjourned now, but we're not really sure exactly what happens. That remains to be seen.
Continued.
One thing we do know was Common Core, and there were a few different pieces of legislation that were passed, and it's called the Common Core Compromise. Can you sort of explain exactly what are we seeing here, and is the governor on board with this?
Good question. So there were 3 bills that made up the Common Core Compromise. They basically set up a process for reviewing Common Core that will start next fall but end, importantly, in 2016. So that through that process, we could see Common Core completely thrown out. We could see the name of Common Core just change and all the standards stay the same. That's probably an option that some people are looking for. We could see tweaks happen. It's not really clear what's going to happen. What is clear is that both sides, the supporters and the opponents, think that they have a good chance to get what they want done, and they're kind of banking on winning the elections, namely the Bessie election and probably some legislative seats. Because if you have an anti-Common Core Bessie board, Common Core is probably going to be chucked. If you have a Bessie board like we have now, Common Core will probably stay possibly under a different name. So that's kind of what the compromise is. They didn't really resolve anything about the standards. It's sort of a compromise of what the process looks like. The governor is reluctantly on board. This takes him out of the process almost completely. In the end, when they do whatever they're going to do, keep Common Core, throw it out, the new governor will have some say over whether it goes or stays. This governor, this almost guarantees he has no say. Common Core is here through the end of his term.
But I think what's interesting about this is that it's going to really make Common Core an issue in the gubernatorial election, whereas in the past it may have been pushed on the side, but we know the new governor is going to have a say-so on this. We know there's high interest in this, and so you can imagine all the debates, all these candidates are going to really have to answer to and articulate on Common Core. So it's probably not going to be lost as an issue.
And also the governor has appointees on Bessie too. So
Right.
they're, not only will the governor get to have a role personally, but
Right.
he, if they're all men at this point, will have some appointees that will have some power.
So for this next upcoming school year, Common Core, as we know it right now in the state of Louisiana, remains in place?
Right. And even the Common Core opponents, or at least the ones in the legislature, I'll say, I mean, Brett Guyman is the biggest Common Core opponent in the legislature. He acknowledges a timeline in which you ditch Common Core before next fall is not realistic. He I think, is playing the long game. Like, I want to get rid of this, but I don't want to create total chaos in the interim.
And he's also term limited too, so he
Right.
doesn't get to, he won't get a vote.
Right.
So the public hearings that are part of that the legislation
right.
calls for, when will those start?
Those will start in the fall. I believe the first round is probably the congressional hearings. There's like a panel that Bessie's appointed to review the standards. To be honest, I'm assuming those are public, but I don't know. Those meetings, probably the public can attend, but I don't know. But the public hearings that were like included in the bill are going to start in the fall, and they'll be all around the state.
Right. Okay. Thanks a lot, Julia. And elections, Errol talked about that, the next governor facing Common Core. So now that we can really start focusing on the
Sure.
elections, because we've got one coming up this fall. How are we looking?
Well, I think the governor's race, it's been going on for quite a while, but it really starts, it's the big show, except for the presidential, obviously. There's a big debate in Harvey and Jefferson Parish next week that will be a little bit of a re-kickoff now that we know what the legislature's done. Really, a lot of the focus is going to be on what didn't happen, the long-term fixes to the budget that everyone's talking about and that did not happen in this session that really nobody thought were going to happen because it's an election year and because Governor Jindal's agenda was so important in that. We have lieutenant governor, an open lieutenant governor race, so that's going to be interesting. A couple candidates from this area, John Young, the parish president of Jefferson, Billy Nungesser, former parish president of Plaquemines, Elbert Guillory, who's a state senator, a black Republican, actually, a rarity, announced this week, Kip Holden, the mayor of Baton Rouge. The other Attorney General, where Buddy Caldwell's running for re-election, Jeff Landrieu, the former kind of Tea Party congressman. We're waiting to see if we might have an additional candidate. There's some talk that perhaps Walt Leger might run. He hasn't said anything yet. And then legislative races, this isn't the big term limits turnover year, but we are going to see some local representatives who have been around for a long time depart. Senator Ed Murray is term limited. We found out just this week that A.G. Crow, the senator from St. Bernard and Tammany, is retiring. He's not term limited, but he's not running for re-election. Tim Burns in Mandeville, Jeff Arnold, who tried to put the Algiers, secede from Algiers with the theory that perhaps that could be a job for him, mayor of Algiers. Guess not. Hope he has a backup plan.
Just for the record, that was never a movement that had a chance to happen.
But it got through the House, which was interesting.
And it got a lot of publicity early in the
did.
session, but it wasn't going to happen.
So that was the question, was it going to be New Jeff City or Newer Orleans, or had some fun with that.
And of course, we have Jefferson Parish elections, too.
Jefferson
Council
Parish
and
election and new
president.
parish president. So we have Mike Yanni and Elton Lagasse.
So it's starting.
That's starting, yes.
So Scott Angel commercial already that's been running with praising women.
He is the first gubernatorial candidate to go up on the air. I think the other is David Vitter is the one with all the money, though.
Yeah.
So you'll expect a big push from him.
With all
later.
these politicians meeting every day in the legislative session, did anybody surface who might not have been thinking about it beforehand? Was there?
For governor?
As a new candidate?
Yeah, for anything, yeah. Or was everything already in place before?
There was talk of another Democrat, a guy named Tony Clayton, running, and he said this week that he would not.
Right.
Right.
Russell Honoré, people still mention. It's getting late.
Any chance for Mitch Landrieu, do you think, to jump in there?
He closed the door.
But
Yeah.
there's still some time to go, and
Right. He's closed the door before and then opened it again, remember? He has a history.
We do know that the mayor that was involved in a fight with the firefighters, but then he's not the only mayor to have been in this dispute with the firefighters. It's been going on for quite a while.
Well, for as long as there have been mayors, there have been firefighters, and as long as there have been mayors and firefighters, there have been fights between the two. And there's certainly been the history in New Orleans, and the firefighters have always been fairly effective at unionizing and organizing and getting all kind of various funds. And there are tensions that go back 30 years in terms of who owes what, and the city says that some of the money was misspent, it wasn't handled well. But there's two orders. One is like for $76 million, and the other is for $25 million that the city is supposed to pay, if to listen to the courts. And, when the mayor gave his State of the Union address, I thought he had a very interesting line. He says, if a judge orders the city to pay $26 million to the firefighters pitching, we need to find the money somewhere. And he says, look instead, though, we could we can reconstruct 60 blocks of streets, repair streetlights for 10 years, fill 650,000 potholes, if they didn't have to pay that $26 million.
But so the courts are saying that the city has to pay, and I want you to get to that because we're just about out of time.
What they did is this week they went before the Judge Reese, and at least they're going to have an arbitration. There's a guy out of Baton Rouge, Bill Perry, and starting on June 25th, the city and the firefighters, they're going to have a month to see if they can come some kind of compromise and some kind of common terms. And then if they don't, then they go back to the judge in July. And I don't know what the judge can do, but the question is whether or not to hold the city in contempt. I mean, I doubt if they ever put Mayor Landrieu in jail, but essentially that's what the situation is. The city has been ordered to pay this money. The city says we can't, and so that's the question. But you just hope that this guy, Perry out of Baton Rouge, can work miracles, because this is a tough issue, and it's really, as you see the mayor's figures, it's really hurting the city.
And it has been one that's been going on for decades, particularly the back pay one. Okay, Errol, thanks a lot. It is time now to look ahead. Errol, we go to you.
Well, if you're willing to have that crawfish ball, you better hurry up, because the season is coming to an end. The crawfish are starting to get hard now, and there's a time it's just over, and it's over, folks. The good news is that Creole tomatoes are coming in, so you go from one red to the other. And so we're at the peak. Whenever the Creole tomato season is the freshest, the crawfish season is coming to an end. So
yummy
this is the
Creole
time.
tomatoes, love those. Jeremy.
The legislature will not be in session on Monday morning, so I'm going fishing. I'm taking a break.
Is everybody safe?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Treat.
I think we're all waiting to see what vetoes are maybe coming out of the session. Not the sexiest issue, but I am waiting to see if there's any chance the governor doesn't veto that TOPS bill, because I think that's something that is going to hit people who haven't been paying attention
with
hard.
tuition's not automatically, with the TOPS award, not automatically increasing with tuition.
Right.
Thanks a lot, Julie.
Speaking of the governor, we got some more details about his upcoming announcement. In 2 weeks, it's going to be not in New Orleans, as they announced, but in Kenner at the Pontchartrain Center. Tickets are available online. They're giving them out. I'm really interested to see who shows up.
Right, it's a big suspenseful thing,
Yes.
right? Do we know what he's going to say?
Right.
We do. Okay.
I do think it'll be interesting to see the crowd, though.
It will be.
And I think there is an expectation there might be some protesters. So
Interesting. Okay, you guys, thanks so very much for being here. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.